Welcome to the podcast of All Means All. In this episode, Nika Maglaperice, Jean Greg, and Maria Petayaneme will talk about advancing inclusive education, policy, practice, and structural changes.
What do you mean when you say that you are a teacher? What do you mean when you say that you are teaching? What kind of characteristics, what kind of attributes come to your mind when you hear the word teacher? And obviously there are like thousands of definitions for it, varieties of ways to express yourself. But what we are trying to do here, what we're trying to grasp here is your own definition of what it means to be a teacher. How would you like your teacher to be? How would you like to teach your group of students?
So now that you've thought about what you think about your own teaching strategies and your own teaching styles, the idea is that we want you to sort of move into thinking about the knowledge and the actual subjects and the topics that are already established for you that you need to teach. So besides obviously your own teaching strategies and your own thinking, there is also then a sort of established amount of information or knowledge that you need to pass on. And therefore, what we would like to do in this process of talking about policy development and policy implementation is to focus a little bit on who gets to decide on what knowledge you're going to disseminate and what knowledge you're going to pass on, and who are the key players and how do they do this through policy development and policy implementation. So, yeah.
Yep, thank you. So if you look at and then what follows from this is that this knowledge becomes institutionalized, and we need teachers for the knowledge to be conveyed and taught to students. So we need to kind of also look at the institution of teacher education as to how it became institutionalized. And if we look at the history of education, the teacher education, we will see that it has emerged through several stages. So initially we used to have what we call pre-industrial stage of teacher education, when it was more informal, and then through the 19th century and 20th century it became more college-based, and nowadays we have university-based teacher education with several kind of variations. You will have mixed models of university-based teacher education, but also college-based and school-based teacher education. But when we look at this history, we also see that the process of teacher education is very much top-down. And when we take a closer look, we see big players. So we see ministries of education in deciding as to what kind of teacher education there will be and the values that inform the teacher education policy. But also increasingly today, we see other global players like the OECD and the EU, in the case of course, Europe.
The UN.
And the UN, the World Bank and UNESCO. Yeah,
EU.
So it is very important to analyze the teacher education policy, because as a teacher, when you go into a classroom, there are certain expectations, there are certain modes of teaching that you're expected to use. And when you critically analyze it, this is the players that actually you're dealing with as a teacher on a daily basis. So even though they seem to be detached from the everyday reality of school, actually they are part and parcel of the whole thing. So that's why I think that to be an effective teacher educator, you also have to have this kind of a bird's eye view to see how there are multiple levels involved in this process.
Yeah, so as Nicholas was saying, basically it is important, as he said, to look into who gets to make these decisions or have an impact or an influence on these decisions, because obviously they play a very important and powerful role. As, for example, Nicholas has mentioned, okay, when we look at the whole system from top to bottom, there are different stakeholders involved throughout all of this. And basically, this includes something which is, on one end, something like an institution which is on a local level, like the ministries, through their curriculum and through their syllabus and the ways of how this is delivered. And then as you go further up, you will see that this is being influenced with other institutions that are much more on a supranational level you know. So for example, you have the EU and the OECD. You would also notice how there will be phases of international studies and international testings that are involved in this process, like PIRLS or PISA, okay, which basically they assess numeracy, literacy skills on various levels, not only just about reading, actual how to read, but also inferential reading. So as you can see, there is this continuous sort of system that goes from the bottom where the teacher sort of is actually in the classroom delivering all of this, but at the same time this is a part of a bigger system, and therefore that is why it is important for a topic like policy development and implementation to be very much reflected about and thought about, because this system in essence has quite a big say, it has quite a big role. So that is on one end what we would like to make sure that by at least this stage you sort of absorb, which leads us to then, you know, establishing power and all of that. Yeah.
So very simply, what both we're trying to say is the structure in which knowledge or policy flows. So dominantly, we see a really top-down flow of information. So if you take the example of Ireland, you see at the top, you would have the EU, you have the UN, which has a lot of influence because Ireland is a very Catholic state, so you would have a really huge influence on by the church. So because of that, the kind of policies Ireland makes, and in general EU makes, would have a lot of influence by the Catholic Church. Bringing along those lines, we can also see that in teaching education or in education in general, the kind of curriculum is made is heavily dependent on the Catholic Church. So what we're trying to say here, or what we're trying to argue through this policy, is that there need not be just a top-down approach, a top-down flow of knowledge, but to make the policy a bit flexible so that there is a bottom-up flow of knowledge and a bottom-up flow of policy formation as well, right? So this is something that we three are really excited about because we feel that whenever there is just a top-down flow of information, a top-down flow of what a teacher is supposed to do, expected to do, the teacher becomes really detached. They don't really care about, you know, their students. What they care about is their tenureship or how they would get permanent, academic success. But if there is a bottom-up approach, if there is a little bit of flexibility where the teacher is able to creatively express themselves, when the teacher is able to actually know their students and then use the policy accordingly, make the curriculum that actually fits the needs of the students, it is only then the teacher is able to contribute and feel a sense of belongingness to the policy. So this is what we both were arguing as well, that we need that active teacher agency where the teacher has the space and the capacity to creatively express themselves in not only, you know, molding the curriculum as per their needs, but also molding the curriculum as per the needs of the students by knowing the students and knowing the geographical and the cultural proximity of where the students comes from, right?
No, and also as you might be wondering, as you know, someone who is about to start teaching, you might be wondering, okay, well, how does this actually become visible in the school, in my daily life of teaching? And as someone who is currently also a primary teacher myself, from the country of Malta, who is a part of the EU and is a part of different international organizations, we have seen how these have impacted our educational system, especially in the last 10 years, whereby we have seen a complete shift of how the syllabus is delivered, and this has been translated into basically learning outcomes, which a teacher has to fulfill and also mark for every individual on the system, on a computer, how much they have achieved of what. And although it is in essence as an idea, it might sound very good because it is giving an individual a specific and very informative information about the development and about the about the achievements of the student. In reality, in practice, what it was doing, it was basically limiting our time. It is currently limiting our time with the students to actually become more communicative, to develop strategies which are more inclusive first of all, and more important than that also diverse in essence of how it's delivered. Maybe it is one-to-one task or a group task, you know. So as a result, what is gradually happening are the job, because it's being coordinated beforehand without our own input, it has come to a position where we are just there being treated as a part of a system and a part of some group of people that need to just disseminate information, to just put up information. And that is causing a lot of difficulties for teachers who would like to really get to know the students and to create something more than that. So the issue here that we would like to bring up is exactly that the idea that although from an outside perspective, from a top-down perspective, you might have a situation where based on results from PISA or PIRLS, policymakers will say, okay, well then we need to do this, and this, so we make sure we achieve this, and this. It doesn't necessarily transpire into what they actually want to achieve, because obviously the teaching process is something which is very humane in reality. It's something which is very interactive, and therefore it needs to have in essence that in its center. And the best way to do this is to actively more regularly involve teachers themselves who are in the classroom to help with the designing of these policies, because that way you would be ensuring that at least the system in the classroom is being kept in mind in the process of writing these policies down.
Especially after COVID, this has become so important, because if I take my own example, because I teach the undergrads, right? So if I take my own example, after COVID, all the students have become so isolated. They don't want to come to school, they don't want to make friends, they don't want to have that college experience that we all literally craved for. And that is something that the University of Maynooth is trying, like literally trying to address it as much as possible. I've been talking this with my professors as well, that I really feel that they need to include our opinions as well, because we are the first person, kind of like a middle ground between the big, scary professor and the naive, innocent student, right? So we are the tutors, so they feel comfortable with us, and they have literally told us that because of COVID, because of staying at home for 2 years, it has made them so isolated that they don't really know how to connect anymore. They don't really know how to engage anymore. So in situations like this, if the teacher or the tutor or whatever knows what the students are going through, knows in what ways, if a topic is taught, if a really boring topic like classical sociological theory is taught and it's made interesting, that students might actually find interesting and would actually want to come in and attend those boring classes and boring lectures. So what I'm trying to say here is it's really crucial that the teachers or tutors know what's going on with their students, knows where they're coming from, how they're coming from, why they are complaining about a particular thing, instead of just punishing them for not doing a particular thing. And I also feel that the professors or the universities, instead of just making a grand assumption, should actually ask tutors like us or teachers like us, who is the first person of contact with them, and ask us what is happening, what kind of information can you get from the students? Why do you think they don't want to come to a class? So things like that, I think, is really important across, it doesn't matter if it's a university, doesn't matter if it's a school. Teachers being active agents and knowing their classroom, knowing their students, and being a part of this policy formation is really important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would like to add about, because you touched upon these, teachers as agentic actors, and I think it's a very important point of the chapter, and it's like the central part of the chapter, in as much as when you look at teacher education policy, it's very much top-down. So we really want teachers to be agentic actors in order to make change happen in ways that best serve the interests of the children and the interests of the teachers from the structural, material and cultural realities that they come from. And also this should be reflective of their past experiences as professionals, and also their past experiences as human beings, and also the aspirations they have, with regard to all of these aspects that I just mentioned. So, in that regard, we try to inform the case studies based on this notion of teachers as agentic, powerful actors. So we all have our case studies. So in my case, the chapter talks about the curriculum, especially in terms of children who come to school and they can't access the language one, and they have a different language, foreign language background. So how does this transition happen in terms of inclusion? How do we help children? How do teachers help children to access the mainstream curriculum? And my colleagues here have their own case studies, so they will talk about this.
Yeah. I think one thing that we need to also make sure that comes through towards the reader and also the viewer of the video is that basically when we are talking about policies, it is not necessarily that all policies are going to have a negative impact. There have been actual successful policies that have managed to do quite a good amount of work, especially in our case of Malta when it comes to inclusion, which sort of regularized and actually recognized specific groups of minorities, what they required in order to ensure and safeguard their inclusion in schools. However, at the same time, again, the people who got to decide this most of the time were outside of the classroom, and that becomes the sort of this common theme through our regarding policy development and implementation, because most of the time it is taking place from the top and not really focusing per se on the implementation itself. For the case of, for example, implementation, it is also good to bear in mind that when we are saying implementation, we are not just implying that, okay, in 2023, we implemented this policy, that's it, it is done. But it is also a reflective and continuous process, an important process to analyze whether this policy has actually been effective in doing so. Again, for the case of Malta and the case that I actually worked on personally in my own studies with regards to LGBT representation in schools, this is something which we have failed to do. So, and in my case, Malta has recognized a large number of rights for the LGBT community and for actually all of its Maltese citizens, and as a result, in order to sort of have this resonate in the education system, we designed a policy which we call a Respect for All framework. Okay, and in it was the first time, and this was also recognized by the ILGA, okay, that we finally recognized the LGBT community within schools, and that this is a minority which requires support and assistance. And this was sort of the first attempt at breaking this boundary and actually recognizing the need of this particular community. However, since this was implemented back in 2014, years passed. I became actually a teacher, an LGBT teacher. I'm a gay teacher, and as a result, you start witnessing how effective and how much of this framework and policy has actually transpired into the system. And when obviously working in schools and also through my research, I've realized, and it wasn't just me, there are multiple of other authors in Malta and researchers who have focused on this. It has indicated that just because there was this policy which is focusing on respect, it is not really impacting the students and the environment for it to ensure to become actually what it is aiming to be. So again, the idea is that when you're looking into policy as a teacher, it is important to look into it not only as a sort of a set of commands that you need to follow, but you look at it through a critical lens. You look at the language that is being used in it and wonder, why is it being there? Why is this being used and not something else? That is something which is very, very important when it comes to reading policy. And it doesn't necessarily have to be someone who is a researcher who does this. I mean, you ultimately have to follow policy. So it is important, first of all, that you read them, but also read them not as this like set of commandments that are not
flexible at all.
They are not flexible, but this is something that you have a very important part in, especially if you come from perhaps a minority yourself, or come from an experience in schools that you would like to actually bring forward a change in. I don't know.
Yeah, that's true. So what we're trying to do with this policy is kind of make it like a middle ground, where you obviously have a set of rules that is universal, that all countries, everyone should follow. So there are universal definitions to it. There is like a general dominant understanding of what a policy or what a curriculum should look like. But it also has a space, it also has a tiny bit of wiggle room where the teacher is able to use its own tactics, use its own tools to implement the policy as it deems fit. Right? So if I bring in the example of my research work that I did back in India among sex workers, they are using policy, they are using education to not only educate their community about what their rights are, how they should manage the violence in their community, but also using sex workers as peer teachers, as peer educators, right? So now the sex workers are not just sex workers who are fighting for their own rights, but they are also becoming active agents. They are also becoming peer educators in educating their community about the rights and the policies that they actually deserve and they actually need to practice when they are doing their own business. Bringing back into the mainstream curriculum, I also feel that sex education is something that is really, really crucial, but often ignored by our mainstream curriculum. Why? That's a different conversation altogether. But what I'm trying to argue here that sex education should be included in the curriculum as early as possible. Because we have seen many cases where the students and the teachers have no idea what they're talking about. And at the end of the day, we all are in the iPad kids generation. Your kid is born with an iPad or a TV or internet, and they would obviously learn all of these bad things, quote unquote bad things first, right? So in order to educate your kid properly, in order to educate your kid in a way so that they know the difference between what is acceptable, what is a good touch versus what is a bad touch, I would like to argue that sex education should be included in the curriculum as early as possible. Right, so that does not mean that it should be universal. What I'm trying to say here is that there might be certain universal definition of what is considered to be sex education, what is considered to be an acceptable form of sex education, but how is that implemented? The kind of tools that you use, the kind of versions, the kind of definitions, the kind of explanation that the teacher uses in order to impart that knowledge will be sensitive to the cultural, social, geographical requirements of the area.
And there you go, once again, you can see how impactful it is for policy itself when it's being written to always keep this in mind. And again, to make sure that this is coming out clear, one way of how this is actually done is by having the teachers, the members who are in the classroom, who deal with the members themselves, the community itself, one-to-one, to have a very, very important and active role. Yeah. So we hope that as you're watching this and later perhaps also reading the article, you sort of realize that this is an important role that you should also embrace, that you are not just there to disseminate knowledge that has been established for you, that you question it and you sort of ensure that any form of challenged or I don't know, maybe information which is keeping out or leaving out a certain group of people or dismissing the rights of an individual, you know, in such a way it is actually something that you can actually do change and make change about. So this is what we're talking about here, sort of, the actual proof of this. Sort of.
So what you're teaching should actually make sense, and it should be implemented in a way that it has some real life visual changes in the community that you're contributing to.
So towards the end of the chapter, We have also included some tools and ways of engaging the policies and practical tools and ways of engaging policy. There's a specific tool when it comes to teacher agencies with how to be a agentic actor when it comes to teacher education policy. So one of the first things that we need to do is to become a reflective practitioners, and the tool that is included in the chapter delineates as to how teachers can go about it in rather simple ways. And there's been research done on it in several countries, and we think that this will be a useful tool for teachers to engage in reflection and then to plan ahead in a way that brings about change that is actually collectively desired by the teachers and by other school staff members, and of course the children and the parents and other important stakeholders on the school level. And this could be an instigator where this power can also kind of flow upwards rather than kind of downwards, because as I mentioned, I think several times, it's been flowing downwards throughout the history of teacher education. And you will read this and you will come across this point made by scholars and researchers over and over again. So hopefully the tools that we present there will help teachers to affect change in their own ways, in a way that this is reflective of the social reality that they operate in.
Yeah, I think this is very, very important that is being said here. The idea that again, you slowly understand your role as a teacher to be more than just giving out information, okay? And especially just as a message to the viewer who might be starting to teach soon, this might feel something that you're going to be, as you often say, ruffle some feathers, you know, and make things very, very maybe feel difficult, as if there is a big wall that you're going to try to challenge. This is the case sometimes, that this is how it happens, you know. In my case, for example, when I try to be representative of different gender identities because I look male, cis male, you know, and then I showed up with nail polish one time. I almost really got, you know, it was a challenge, even just that. But just to give you an idea, just to give you a sense of what I mean, just trying to break away from this set of structures that are almost physically felt in a school, it is something that is important. Naturally, always, if you're going to do it responsibly as well. You know, might not necessarily be right, for example, about the change that you are going to do. And this is why, for example, then we also included in the reading section a section which looks into actually teachers as researchers. So it is important that if you have this idea or this change that you are willing to want to see, it is important to organize oneself with other people, first of all, and get their insight about how they feel, and also then, you know, slowly look into other possibilities and access different research perhaps to become more aware of what is currently going on, and then become you feel like you can provide much more to the policy development itself. You cannot just go into it, what I mean is, you cannot just go into it unprepared, you know? Yeah. There is the experience of teaching, but also at the same time you need to be sort of well read into the idea that you're going to try to push forward, I guess.
So I'd like to kind of take upon what you mentioned about teachers as researchers, because this is a crucial point when it comes to teacher education, because the research that emerges around teacher education and the research that informs teacher education policy comes from universities, comes from these international organizations that we have been talking about. And so this knowledge is generated by these organizations from upper echelons. Yeah. So teachers as researchers actually will be generating knowledge from the very classrooms, from the very lived experiences that they experience on a daily basis. And this kind of research is very valuable. And because this would be a policy, teacher education policy informed by teachers' lived experiences would be the most apt and the most relevant research that actually helps teachers to improve the practice?
I think I would just end this discussion with a slogan which I really, really want the viewers to popularize it, is that an inclusive, reflective teacher always results in an inclusive, representative policy. So if you remember that slogan, if you just make that slogan as a part of your life, I believe that policy of the future would not be just a top-down instructions on what a teacher should do, but it would be a more inclusive, more representative, more active policy that has that has challenged the power imbalances and is actually able to implement in a much more effective way. Thank you.
And trust me, it actually makes the job much more fun.
It does.
Because you don't get to just sit down and
just
teach
nod your
what
head
you're
along,
telling. Yeah. You become an active person.
Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the podcast of All Means All. In the show notes, there is a link to the chapter in the open textbook. There you can find the transcript of the video and more information on the topic.